Welcome to episode 139 of the Necronama.com. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now. What is this? Some little drawings? I'll just put that in my pocket for later.
And I'm Don Guillory, author, historian, educator, co-host of this podcast. And I really didn't appreciate watching this movie, a couple of times because it gave me flashbacks to my first marriage, the wedding night. So, we all have our own personal night of the demon.
Oh, man. So joining us this week, Charles Cutting is here. Charles, hello. Welcome to the show, man.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your projects?
Yes, thank you. I'm an artist and writer working in graphic novels. I've published 4 books, 2 with Open University, which is a UK's largest distance learning university. I published a Lovecraftian graphic novel called Kadath, which was a sort of satirical swipe at H.P. Lovecraft, as well as an adaptation of one of his books. And I'm also working on a sort of modern fairy tale set in between the Second World War and the Third World War, or in a world a bit like that, not really set in Britain, actually. And it's sort of inspired by all kinds of stuff. So that's available on Comixology, and it's called The Fiery Crown. And all this information is on actually the homepage of my site, which is charlescutting.com, which was very expensive when I bought it 10 years ago, but is still the best thing I have ever bought. And I'm really, really pleased that Rareform New Media did such a good website for me, and it's still the gift that keeps on giving. So please visit the site.
Very cool. My website is the opposite. I built it myself. Don't go there. No. No, that's really neat. I knew that you had done a lot of stuff. I didn't know about all of those. The Lovecraft one, I still haven't gotten to it. I want to.
That's right.
Anything that satirically lampoons Mr. Lovecraft is automatically gold in my books. So I'll be all over that.
Yeah, he's one of those writers that you can just sort of rip into with impunity, knowing that it won't really spoil it for the fans. And he deserves to be kind of. Anyway, I could talk about that, but I probably start going on and on and on. And you've invited me to talk about Night of the Demon.
No. So, go ahead. Tell us more about it first. We'll get there.
Very briefly, with Kadath, I was working on it because our first daughter had just been born, and I thought, how am I going to keep the artwork going while I'm running around changing nappies and doing all this and going to work? And I thought, I'll do a comic strip, and I'll do a drawing a day, and I'll do the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, because it's sort of quite imaginative, and it's got lots of different settings and creatures and whatnot. And then I sort of came round halfway through and thought, oh my God, this is like doing a graphic adaptation of Mein Kampf, given Lovecraft's sort of, views and things. And I thought, how can I carry on? And it was really dull. And I thought, oh, well, obviously Lovecraft was less than pleasant in his views, in his opinions and his worldviews. He was kind of frightful. And I thought, I'll make the main character a bad guy. I'll make I'll make it about a villain. And it seemed to free up all the story elements. I went back and rewrote bits of it and added bits, and it was sort of where I feel like I found my feet as a storyteller, although some of the dialogue is a bit clunky in hindsight, and I didn't really sort of know much about writing as I do now subsequently from having researched screenwriting, but I kind of actually managed to get it finished and published by a company called Sloth Comics, who are a indie publisher based in Edinburgh now, and it came out in 2015, and I'm still quite proud of it, really. So that's...
You should be proud of it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Getting published is an achievement in itself, I think.
Oh, yeah.
So...
I think any artist, whether it's authors or graphic artists or anything else, like we all feel that way. Like I look at stuff I wrote even a year ago And I'm like, oh my God, that's terrible. What was I thinking? but like a year from now, the stuff that I think is pretty decent right now, I'm going to think, oh my God, what was I thinking? You know?
Yep.
I would love to know what Stephen King would think if he like went back to like his early stuff and started looking through it, you know? But I think that's just normal. I think that's all of us. Like as our viewpoints change and our experiences change, how we would have written a story changes. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the process because, I mean, if you're looking at even, we'll get to the film in a second, but if you look at a film from 20, 30 years ago, whenever these arguments come up about, oh, I can't believe they're rebooting this or they're, doing an adaptation of this. We're living in a different time period and there are different circumstances that could affect this. So, we're going through this nostalgia moment right now where we're transitioning from the 80s to the 90s. So we could easily go back and have a movie that's from the 90s that somebody says, oh, we really got to remake, I don't know, Boys in the Hood. Right. Let's go with non-horror. We got to remake Boys in the Hood because circumstances have changed in LA. So if you have a story like that, now you're going to approach things like gentrification, which wasn't part of that story. So there are all these things that are going to be part of it. And the same thing when we're writing our own things or focusing on different things. You have so much of life that comes into your art in whatever medium that you choose. But there's so much of life that comes into it that's going to affect and influence the way in which, in whatever you create, as far as what's going to be the emphasis or what you're going to omit. And the same thing as far as like when you go back and look at stuff that you've done previously, you've gained so much as far as insight. Hopefully you've gained insight, but you've gained insight. You've got new experiences. You'll look back and say things like, oh, crap, I can't believe, I was blind to this issue. Or I didn't bring this forward, which is very essential when people start looking and comparing not only their own work but other people's work and see the development and the evolution of their work over as small as 1 year, as James mentioned, to their entire career.
Yeah, that ties in nicely, I feel, to talking about the movie later, which is from the 50s.
Absolutely.
And the 50s in the UK were it was the sort of tail end of the Victorian era, really. Those Victorian attitudes had sort of survived into the 50s, and it was a very prescriptive society. And it was a society that expected certain things from people. And, women were to get married, men were supposed to go out and sort of be the breadwinner. It was sort of, if you had an affair or if you got a divorce, that was shocking, and you were persona non grata. Kind of, it was seen as it was this very structured, straight-laced sort of society, which obviously now looking back on is. It's interesting. It's like a time capsule. So, yes, every artist or writer is sort of either consciously or unconsciously reflecting the age that they're creating in. And then that's why it's kind of fascinating to go back and see even something from the 90s and think, wow, how attitudes have changed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. Yeah.
And then you just have timeless things. Like, I will always make fun of Lovecraft. No matter how old I get, I will make fun of what a terrible person he is. It won't matter what year it is. And we will always have white men starting cults and causing problems. So, I mean, this movie, this movie really fits in still. So let's jump over to that. Why did you pick Night of the Demon?
It is, I think, quite possibly my favourite film of all time, and I must have seen it about 20 times. And I remember first coming across it when I was a child, and we used to get a TV listings magazine called the Radio Times, and they used to employ illustrators. So I used to have really nice painted covers, and there was a reproduction of the poster on it. And I can't remember how old I was. I must have been pretty small, like 10 or something. And I instinctively knew that was the kind of movie that I wanted to watch, and that if I watched it, I would enjoy it and really like it. And then I think my parents didn't let me watch it because they thought it might be a bit frightening. And then I caught it on terrestrial TV and just loved it. And it ticks all sorts of boxes for me. It's black and white. And I think movies about the past look more real if they're in black and white. So if you watch something like The Untouchables, it doesn't seem as authentic as if you watch The Roaring Twenties with Humphrey Bogart. That looks more like the past, the black and white version for me. So I love the fact it had a monster in it. And I was sort of familiar with the M.R. James stories and had read them growing up. And it really captured my imagination. And I keep coming back to it because I think it's such a wonderfully structured story. It doesn't seem to ever, in my opinion, it never sags. It's never baggy. There's never a scene where you think, rewatching it, I'll just fast forward past this bit. Everything about the script, the script is very good. And, it has all kinds of hidden sort of psychological currents going on, which I sort of would like to get into a bit later on.
Definitely,
especially around the protagonist and the antagonist. So the protagonist, for people who've not seen it, is an actor called Dana Andrews, and he was a big movie star back in the day. He was sort of on a par with somebody like maybe Bruce Willis or a similar kind of stature, if you see what I mean. And unfortunately, he kind of dissipated his talent through alcoholism, and he was a old school Hollywood boozer. And by the time he hit the 1950s, he was sort of his star was fading. And then the antagonist is Dr. Julian Carswell. It's Julian Carswell. It's not Doctor, is it? It's just Julian Carswell in the film. And he's this sort of black magician, Aleister Crowley-esque figure. It has been sort of posited. But the real hero of the film, both in the book and both in the short story and in the movie, is Harrington. So in the movie, it's Joanna Harrington, who's played by Peggy Cummins. And in the book, it's just a sort of nondescript Englishman called Harrington who turns up to help the main character. And the performance by Niall McGuinness of Carswell is just wonderful. And also because there's a sort of time capsule like quality about it as well, where they're inhabiting this 1950s society where Satanism was seen as a deeply shocking and offensive thing. And, now in our day and age, there are Satanists who seem, as far as I can make out, to kind of propose a sort of rational humanist sort of agenda, as far as I can make out. And it seems to be an act of rebellion rather than how people in the 1950s would have taken it as sort of something profoundly wrong and blasphemous. And it encompasses all these ideas for me, and I keep coming back to it, and I keep finding something new in it every time I watch it. Basically,
see, that's the sign of a good movie when you can actually find something that you didn't see before, or you find a new perspective, as well as our own individual personal growth. But yeah, it's even when you mention the change from the book to the film, where the book it's Harrington, it's male. Whereas in the film, it's Joanna Harrington. And something I didn't think about until you just mentioned it was, one, they seem to make, and this is just my observation, it might just be 2021 eyes looking at this, but they seem to make Joanna on par with Dr. Holden and did not have her as a love interest or as someone that he had to pursue or she was pursuing him. She was pursuing an answer. Yes. As Holden was pursuing an answer. And that was, even from the first moment that you meet her, she's up on the plane with the light on and reading and going through all these things, trying to figure out exactly what happened. Whereas you see that contrast between her and Dr. Holden, where he's kind of like, I need to get some sleep. I've got a big thing I have to solve. And meanwhile, she's a row behind him, trying to figure out an answer to the problem that he's actually being sought after to solve.
Yes. And there's a lovely interaction with the seat, and it sort of sets it up very nicely as the sort of tussle of their relationship, because she's my idea is that she's the only adult in the film. Holden, who is this sort of stubborn guy who says, I think, all scientists should be from Missouri and they should say, show me. And he's completely convinced in his rationality, and he's utterly convinced that the Carswell Devil Cult is a hoax, and that he hasn't heard about the death of Harrington's uncle yet, which is the opening scene in the film. And she's the only one who, ironically enough, is a primary school teacher as well, who somehow manages to drive a really nice car. She's got that little sports car thing she drives around in, which is, I don't know how she'd afford that on a primary school teacher's salary. But anyway, she's the one who almost treats him like a child at certain stages. And obviously Carswell, who lives at home with his mother, throws children's parties dressed as a clown. And he is sort of a kind of monstrous child. And there's a sort of side of him that, although he knows he should keep this secret, and he doesn't want to be investigated by Holden, there's another side of him that wants to be acknowledged that he is powerful. And so he's got this, whereas Joanna is sort of the better psychologist than Holden, in fact, because she knows how to manipulate him into hopefully being safe. So, yes.
I love the idea of her being the only adult. I think that really sums it up. Like, everybody acts like such childish, stubborn ways,
Yes. I mean, Holden's particularly stubborn, and she kind of has to step in and say there's a bit where he is making a pass at her, and he's sort of, she's trying to say that no, you need to just sort of stop that and concentrate, because there is a mystery here, and I think there's something to it. And he's just like, oh well, she's a pretty girl, I'll try and chat her up, and she's trying to get him to take it seriously.
And I loved that, because they worked so, like, maybe they didn't work hard, maybe it feels that way, but it feels so set up for the love story that, like, as soon as they were on the plane, I was like, oh no, here we go.
Yeah.
And then it didn't happen.
Heads against each other.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then it didn't happen, and I was like, oh my God, thank you. This is fantastic.
Yes.
And but also going back to her being a school teacher, that's actually really fascinating in how she not that she controls their movements, but how she deals with all of the men in this film, because it's very much like hurting school children.
Yeah. Well, she has to trick Holden to come along to the seance, and with the help of the villain's mother, who, but I'll get to that in a bit. What I wanted to do, if it's all right, is just talk about the differences between the story and the movie very quickly.
Well, you're in charge. Take us wherever you want to go.
So, getting back to how sort of, I mean, this was a story written by M.R. James, who is about the most sort of conservative establishment type of Englishman imaginable at the time, who was devoutly religious, quite sexist, very reactionary. But he had this sort of amazing imagination. He used to invite his students in at Christmas time, and he used to read them his latest story as an entertainment, and then somebody persuaded them to write them down. But Casting the Runes is quite different from his other stories, because all his other stories are sort of obsessed with antiquity and old ghosts coming out of ancient ecclesiastical architecture and all the sort of magical tomes, if you will, in his stories are ancient Christian texts or somehow biblically related, because he was a medievalist. But Casting the Runes is the odd one out, because it's obsessed with modernity. So the supernatural menace, the curse, manifests itself through things like advertisements on electric trams, and the runes are Nordic, which is quite unusual for M.R. James to go out of his sort of Judeo-Christian mythos for his creatures. But the main difference between the two is that the character of Carswell. So in the story, Carswell has maybe 2 lines. He pops up in one scene, and they barely say something to him. Harrington and Durning, I think it is in the story, barely speaks to him. But he's in the story, he's much more of a sort of, he's not as sort of smooth and urbane as he is in the movie. So he's an obsessive attention seeker. He's been bombarding the main character with letters demanding that his genius be recognized. The children's party is in the story, but it's a kind of sadistic attack on them because they come into Lufford Hall and he wants to terrify them so much that they won't come trespass on his property. And he shows them this awful slideshow with spectral hopping creatures chasing children through the forest at night, and the images seem to come alive and sort of come out of the screen, and the kids are absolutely distraught and sort of traumatized by it. Whereas in the movie, he explicitly says, "Oh, I love children; they're so imaginative, and they really live in this sort of numinous world of magic." And in the story, he actually is enjoying the process of cursing people, but in the movie, Carswell does everything he possibly can do to not pull out the big guns and slip him the runes. And also in the story, he's something of a social climber. And the main characters are looking down on him because his English grammar is not very good and his book was awful, and they're being frightfully snobby. And in the movie, he's very posh. But in the story, he's acting out of sort of sadism and glee, whereas in the film, he actually explicitly says, "I do what I do out of fear." My followers are afraid of me, and I'm afraid of these forces, and you get nothing for nothing. He's explaining it to his bullying his mother, really, who wants him to stop, but he's too far in. So it had a really interesting history, because there is a book by a film author on kind of film studies called Tony Earnshaw, and he wrote a great book called Beating the Devil, which I was going to buy on Amazon, but it's 70 quid.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's secondhand, 70 quid secondhand. So
that's secondhand? Oh my gosh.
I went into the Round reading room in the centre of Oxford City, which is a beautiful kind of old 17th century building, and I got it out and skim read it. So I should really kind of give credit where credit is due. But the process of the writer was Charles Bennett, who worked with Hitchcock on the 39 Steps. Primarily, that's his most famous one, the original, with Robert Donat. And he was very fascinated by this idea of the runes being slipped to somebody. So he wrote an initial screenplay, and the initial screenplay, I think, was called The Haunted. No, it was called The Bewitched, sorry. And it has all these interesting details in it. And because the book is so expensive, and I think, they're not going to do a second edition, I hope that if Tony Earnshaw is listening, he'll forgive me for sort of spilling some of the secrets from the book. But in the original script, getting back to just how sort of censorious British society was and how prim and proper, really, it had to go through the British Board of Film Classification, and the initial script was objected to on a number of. It was originally designed to be a children's movie. This is really funny. It was he wanted to write it as a children's movie, but there's a bit where Carswell apparently pulls a snake from a hat instead of the puppies, which he hands out to the children in the film. And the demon was described as a sort of dinosaur-like creature. There was apparently some kind of golf scenes, but it was rejected by the film classification board because there was a painting of a black mass, which was sort of sounded like a sort of softcore pornographic painting of young women sort of coupling with horned demons, and that was seen to be very risque, and they couldn't show that. And also, So at one point, one of the characters uses the exclamation "Oh hell," and this was seen as blasphemous and would have to be removed. Would have to be removed from the script because we can't have that kind of language at the cinema. Apparently,
they would not like me. Jeez,
I don't think they would like the entire 21st century. I mean, yeah, we've sort of ditched a lot of that sort of minding our p's and q's. There's also a scene where Carswell makes a cat levitate in the air, and so this, and most importantly, with towards the end, the farmer Rand Hobart, who's under hypnotism, who's one of the cult, comes out with a sort of semi sort of satanic spiel about good being bad and bad being good and down is up, and that's what they believe. In the original script, it was very overtly satanic, and this was deemed to be not acceptable, and it had to be toned down. So he had this script. Charles Bennett had this script, and he took it to RKO Pictures, and for a while, Dick Powell, was interested. And then things were lagging on, and he thought it was going into development hell. And he bumped into Hal Chester, and Hal Chester was this kind of very kind of abrasive Brooklyn-born guy who was the youngest of 7 children, and he'd been a child actor. He'd worked as a magician's assistant. He'd done some acting. Somehow he'd managed to talk his way into becoming a producer in about 1945. And then he decided to come over to England, and he bumps into Charles Bennett in the foyer of a hotel and sort of railroads him, or somehow kind of suckered him into signing over the rights to the script. And just after he'd done it, Charles Bennett got a call from RKO saying, yes, we'll let you direct it and write it. And so he was kicking himself, and he didn't like Hal Chester anyway. He was duty bound to work on it, and so they got Jacques Tourneur in to direct it, who'd previously done horror films like The Cat People, I Walk with a Zombie, a classic film noir called Out of the Past with Robert Mitchum and Kirk Douglas, and I want to say Germaine Greer, but no, sorry, not Germaine Greer. She's the author. Jane Greer, I was thinking. I can't remember who the femme fatale was, but they brought him in because he was so good with the black and white photography, and he really knew how to light the setup to make the shadows really rich. And one of the things I love about this movie is the blacks are inky black and the light is sort of blazing white, and it's all very dramatic and defined and sort of dynamic. So Jacques Tourneur was a French who'd come over, and most people called him Jack Turner. But as a boy, he enjoyed exploring the haunted houses of Los Angeles with his pet Alsatian dog, I found out. So he was all kind of primed to do this, and thought, right, well, I'm going to need some kind of allies against Hal Chester, who was quite a formidable figure, apparently. So he brought in Donna Andrews and Peggy and Ken Adam. And Ken Adam was the production designer who was his design for the demon is very quick and sketchy. It's a sort of how you'd imagine a sort of, I don't know, a medieval demonic figure from a woodcut or a Renaissance painting, or that kind of image. But in the Tony Earnshaw book, his real genius comes through in the interiors that he designs, and he would design them. They build them from scratch. So every interior you see in that movie was designed by him and built at Elstree and lit by Tourneur and his director of photography. So, and then Ken Adam, of course, went on to design the War Room for Doctor Strangelove and a lot of the Bond films. He did a lot of the designs for Goldfinger and the first 7 Bond films. And one of his last movies was The Madness of King George, which was a 90s movie.
Right.
So he had this sort of, he was a German Jewish immigrant who arrived in the UK and then joined up in the RAF and went off to fight his own country, as it were. And he was a phenomenal designer, and the designs in the book the reproductions of his drawings are absolutely beautiful, and he really kind of gets the sort of crushing sense of doom. Say, for example, at the Harrington house, it's all very darkly lit and sort of quite oppressive, with the stairs kind of going up triangularly and almost sort of like pinning the main characters in. So you could sort of see his thought process there. But of course, Charles Bennett didn't want there to be a demon actual monster pop up in it at all. He wanted it to be left to the imagination of the moviegoer to decide whether or not the supernatural existed or it didn't exist. And Hal Chester said, well, we're making a monster movie. We've got to have a monster in it.
Right.
The financiers want a monster. Jacques Tourneur didn't want a monster. Dana Andrews didn't want a monster. But of course, they all got overruled. And that was sort of put in post-production. And I think it might even have been put in after Jacques Tourneur had shot most of the film. And there was a really interesting guy called Cy Enfield, who was a script doctor, and he was one of the few people who actually liked Hal Chester, because most people thought Hal Chester was such a colossal arsehole. They didn't really want to have much to do with him, Cy Enfield was sort of fleeing the McCarthy witch hunts, and he'd been blacklisted in Hollywood, and he couldn't work there, so he'd come over to the UK, and he was very paranoid, and Hal Chester got him in as a script doctor to write, I guess, the scenes. And I think I even read somewhere there was a rumor that he might have even directed the scenes with the demon, where the demon turns up. But in the Tony Earnshaw book, a good point is made, which is that the opening scene where you see the demon itself is a whopping great bit of dramatic irony, and it helps state the case for the film, because it helps create the tension, because as the viewer, that the supernatural terrifying entity exists. But here's the protagonist who's sort of not only sort of doesn't believe in it, but will ignore all evidence presented to him that this could be real. And so it's I was going to just sort of mention a bit about how it's sort of influenced other creative people, because Martin Scorsese is a big fan of this film, and John Carpenter actually also watched it and liked it, but interestingly enough, he didn't like Dana Andrews or Peggy Cummins in the main role. And I mean, obviously John Carpenter's a visionary filmmaker, but I would disagree with him, because I thought they were excellent, and I particularly think Peggy Cummins was very good to hold her own against two big screen presences like Niall McGuinness and Dana Andrews, and really kind of stand out.
I love all three of them. I can't imagine anybody else doing it. Like, I don't know. That's weird to me.
I can't even think of anybody who would take those roles if it were remade today, because there was the 1980 version, but I can't think of who would actually be able to pull it off.
Yes, it would have to be
in a 2020s version of it.
Well, obviously he can't do it because he's dead, but I would love to see Alan Rickman. Alan Rickman,
yes,
as what's the antagonist's name? I totally love. Thank you. I would love to see him as Coswell. I think that would be an amazing match.
That would be very good, and maybe Gemma Arterton perhaps as the Joanna Harrington character, but I can't think who. Dana Andrews was. He was a bit of a handful, because he obviously drank a lot, and later on in his life, he actually managed to get on top of it, and he kind of advocated for people to quit. But at this point in his life, he was still very much in the thrall of the booze. And when the plane landed, Hal Chester was there with another company guy from Columbia Pictures, and the door to the plane opened, and Dana Andrews kind of came tumbling down the steps and sort of collapsed in a drunken heap at the bottom. And the executive said, "This is your leading man, Mr. Chester." And Hal Chester said, "No, put him on the plane and send him back." And the other executive said, "Oh, I can't do that. He's best friends with the head of Columbia Pictures. You have to work for him." And Dana Andrews immediately went on a 3-week-long bender, where, according to Chester, he must have been drinking all the time. Chester thought he was drinking in his sleep, or somebody was giving him shots in his sleep, because he could swore that Dana Andrews would wake up drunk. But Peggy Cummins, she really liked him, Dana Andrews, and got on really well with him, and they remained friends for the rest of their lives, I think, after that movie. But she said that he could look at a page of script and read it twice and remember it. So he had this phenomenally good memory, despite, the constantly kind of, I guess, abusing himself with alcohol.
Wow.
And he was very much on the side of the director, and they invited a specialist, an expert on witchcraft, who was a witch herself, and her name was, he said, looking through his, there we go. So Margaret Murray was a witch herself and an academic and expert on Wiccan. And she turned up, and Dana Andrews was quite drunk, and he kissed her, or he made a sort of overly affectionate display towards her, which alarmed everybody, as you can imagine. But this was sort of in the days where the star, was it was the director and the producer's job to kind of manage this kind of bad behaviour and get the movie over the line. He was the youngest of 13. He was the third of 13 children from somewhere in born in a farmstead somewhere in the Midwest, I think. And he originally trained to be a singer, and then he became this big star. And then here he was, sort of in England. Whereas sort of Peggy Cummins had a much more she worked at the Dublin Gate Theatre, and she got in there through the schools program, like a lot of theatres do, is they get young aspiring actors and actresses in from the dance schools and the singing schools, and they give them some experience, usually in pantomime, and that's how she got into that. And then she'd gone over to the States because she was a great beauty, and then she decided to come back to England, I think because she wanted to get married, and she came back and she did a lot of work with disability charities in the 70s.
Okay.
And she was also, in 2013, she hosted the premiere of the digitally remastered version of this movie, which was, appropriately enough, screened in the courtyard of the British Museum, which is where the round reading room used to be. And now it's a big big architectural space. And then Niall McGuinness, he started off as a surgeon. He was trained as a doctor. He was a surgeon in World War II. Then he got into acting. His other most notable role, I suppose, is Jason in the Argonauts. He's Zeus in that. And in the 70s, he decided to give up acting and go back to being a doctor in County Wicklow. And then he had quite a funny quip. He made Peggy Cummins laugh, I think, when there's the scene where he's taking her out of a trance at the end. He quipped in the final scene, "I'm a hex maniac," which she thought apparently was quite amusing. So the feud started to sort of grow between, on the one hand, Hal Chester, and then on the other hand, Charles Bennett and Jacques Tourneur, who I think was kind of quite sort of phlegmatic about it, and decided that the studio were going to put a monster in, and he was just going to do his best to do the best possible movie he could. But he didn't get to edit it all, interestingly enough. I think it went back to the States to be edited in the States, because he wanted to do the scene where Holden breaks into Lufford Hall at night and the cat turns into a leopard and attacks him, which is quite comical when you watch it now, because it's quite clearly a man wrestling with a stuffed leopard.
I love that.
The visual effects, they didn't age well. Everything else did.
Yeah, I would argue that I enjoyed it more than if it was like done today. Like I liked that they did that. Like,
well, it's like in Frankenstein where they throw the guy off the windmill.
That's my favorite part. You know that. But there's something about like that's what they used at the time. And
right.
And I don't know, like I don't know how to explain it, but there's something about the atmosphere of older films where I'm just like, that totally works for me. Even like when we talked Wolfman, and there's the weird scenes that are just terribly shot like that, like it's the same thing for me. Yeah. If you did it today, I'd be annoyed, but like looking back, I love it.
Yes, it has a certain charm to it, and it's certainly when the monster's not there and you're just involved in the story, and as it's being portrayed to you by the actors, it is, if you didn't see the demon, it would, it would be kind of gripping. There are scenes which are tense in it. The scene where he breaks into Lofford Hall, which has incidentally a lovely shot in it, where he comes in through the ladder and he's in a sort of junk room, and there's some antlers on the wall, and as he kind of walks under the antlers, just for a second he stops, and it looks like he's got antlers himself because his head is just superimposed over the shield,
right?
Which they're on, and there was a nice little touch, and then he's going downstairs, and Carswell has obviously made himself invisible and is sort of following him down, and then sort of is frightfully British and polite, and it's, so are you trying to break into my house? So would you like a cup of tea? Must be thirsty work.
Nothing compared if that story had been shot in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, he would have gotten shot in the United States.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So there's an interesting kind of comparison that's made between, is Carswell based on Aleister Crowley? So getting back to the original story, did M.R. James base Carswell on Aleister Crowley? And the jury's out on this one, because although Crowley was quite notorious in the papers and he had become a bit of a kind of public figure from prior to 1911, which is when the story was published, he'd also been sort of portrayed in a sort of thinly veiled portrait by Somerset Maugham, who wrote a book called The Magician, where the main character is Oliver Haddo, who I believe crops up in Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen at some point, I think. Oliver Haddo, as this sort of fictional magician, is based on Crowley. So it is possible, I suppose. But, and in the story, Carswell's very thin-skinned, and so was Crowley. He was obviously a raging narcissist and couldn't abide any kind of conflict, because Crowley got into a huge argument with W.B. Yeats, the poet, and he wrote in a letter to a friend afterwards, he said, Yeats is filled with a black bilious rage because he knows I am the better poet than he is. And they were all in the Golden Dawn. And so it is possible that there is a sort of Crowley-esque quality about it. But when you see there's one of the main scenes, one of my favorite bits in it is the children's party when they turn up, and Carswell looks like a tramp or a clown. He's got a battered top hat. He's got clown makeup on, and he's entertaining the children, and he's being, sort of frightfully good fun. And it's this sort of tarot imagery for me, where he appears to be the fool, but in actual fact, he is obviously the magician. So that was a really nice touch, which is not in the story. And there's all sorts of interesting subtexts here, because, his mother says, oh, Julian's so fond of children, but he's not married. Are you married, dear? And she's trying to kind of set them up. And she's like, no, I'm not. And then he sort of sends her away to get some ice cream, or where he's going to sort of demonstrate his powers to Holden. And the way they did that is they had 4 World War II aeroplanes, Spitfires, something like that, fighter planes with the wings removed. And they fired up the propellers, and they had tons of dead leaves. And they just switched on the planes, and it created this enormous wind that kind of practically blew the actors across the lawn and the deck chair, and lots and lots of leaves. So that was how they accomplished that, because it is very dramatic, and
very well done.
I also really, practical effects. Yes, very good practical effects in that. And he's talking about the snakes and ladders game, and he says, I always used to like sliding down the snakes rather than going up the ladders. And Holden says, oh, that must mean you're a good loser. And he says, no, I'm not.
I love that scene.
It's all wonderful stuff. And I think it really works, the lightness of the tone initially, with him being all kind of pleasant and charming and sort of lovable. Although, so anybody who still lives with their mother and entertains children, the local children at parties, I feel is not to be trusted. But
yeah,
they don't
no kidding.
To see this. They don't seem to see this, or maybe Joanna does, because she always seems to be very kind of clear-eyed about the people around her. And it's really interesting how she has to trick Holden and basically treat him like a sort of a child that has to be led, or you can't tell the child everything. And then they turn up to the séance, and there's another lovely thing about the way that it's shot. There's the scene where they've gone back to the Harrington house, and the lights have gone out, and she's got the candles in front of her, and there's a fire, but because of the pylon has come down, there's no electricity. And if you look at it, it's framed so that the fire is sort of at his back, a bit like the flames of hell coming to get him. Mm-hmm. And the candles are in between them, a bit like she's the sort of light of reason, or she's the light of common sense and knowledge. And he's oblivious and unaware to this sort of threat. And the way Turner frames the scenes to give you these kind of almost subconscious messages about the story is just lovely. And they reference, of course, the Samuel Taylor Coleridge Rime of the Ancient Mariner quote, which is like one that's on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. And that's not only does it set the scene kind of wonderfully, it's embellished the scene, but it's also really influential bit of poetry. I mean, Coleridge has influenced Frankenstein, and it even cropped up in Doctor Who, I think, a Tom Baker episode called Image of the Fendal, where the writer was directly inspired by this. And, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's my favourite book, but, that's heavily influenced by Coleridge. So I think this is interesting because also it's in the M.R. James story as well. He sort of included this, and she's desperately trying to get him to see sense, and he's just like, "Oh, never mind about that. How about a kiss?" kind of thing. Right. and she's like, "No, you're not taking this seriously." So, and the séance is just fantastic. It's so British. It's just there's something about it that is just so 1950s and British. And here they are. And there's this Mr. Meek comes in, and it's all kind of like, oh, get out the cake, and here, have a biscuit with the tea. And then the bit with the child's voice coming out of Mr. Meek's voice, that still freaks me out to this day. It makes hairs rise on the back of my neck just to think of it, because it was so unexpected and unnatural, and sort of really, really kind of quite horrible. And the interesting thing about this scene is because Mrs. Carswell has set it up, and she specifically says, "I always come to see Mr. Meek with my problems." Now, what this sort of says to me is that she's always had this interest in the supernatural and the occult, and that she might be partially responsible for her son's interest in it. And that might be why Julian Carswell has become this sort of evil magician character. And it might be that she feels sort of guilty because it's a very telling line, and none of the lines in it none of the lines of dialogue are kind of wasted. They're or flippant or kind of hastily done. They all it seems to be really well written. From my point of view, that this is implying that in some way she feels some responsibility or guilt because it's her son who's doing something that she knows is wrong, and she desperately wants him to stop. But she's worried if, like sort of family members can be, they're worried if it's their fault, especially parents. It's like, is it my fault the way my son has kind of created this devil cult and probably murdered academics to keep, to keep his anonymity. And of course, Holden is really inconsiderate and just sort of bullish and quite unreasonable. But you can see why, from his point of view, he thinks what he thinks. It's not like, oh, you idiot, snap out of it. At every step of the way, you can think, yeah, but he would think that, and his explanations are really plausible. It's just like, oh, she's looking after her son. She's just trying to put us off. She's trying to scare us. So we'll drop the inquiry. And then, he's not, he's cynical, and, he thinks there's an explanation for everything. But we, of course, know that there is no explanation for this, and that he's really in trouble. So Yes. There's another thing about from the reason why I think this is a very well researched script, and I think Bennett had bothered to look into folklore and magic and how it works, or it chimes really nicely. He at least understands it. Is there's a bit where Carswell says, "Oh yes, Joanna Harrington. She believes she can see. She can. She believes she's alive. She is. She believes that you will die tomorrow. You will." And it's a curse. It's an affirmatory curse to done in three to sort of really, really kind of lay it on thick and sort of make sure that the subject is suitably terrified and that it will happen, because of course there's always the possibility that Carswell knows that he might get the parchments back by accident. So there's an element of danger in it for him. So he's doing everything he possibly can do to force Holden down this path of doom. And it's getting to the point where he actually just wants Holden to admit that he's right. And so Carswell is starting to make mistakes because he's starting to make bad decisions that could expose him, even though he rationally knows he shouldn't be doing that. The child in him wants to be recognized, and for his to be noticed, really. So he's losing his grip on it, and it's quite fascinating to see this kind of very powerful villain kind of coming apart over the course of the film, which is sort of part of his he's on a sort of downward trajectory. And then we get to, did you watch the UK version or the American version?
We both watched the UK because I told Don that we would lose 13 minutes otherwise. So I sent him the link. Anybody out there who watched the Amazon version, you missed out on a ton of stuff. But I literally don't understand how they cut from this, because I feel it's a pretty tight script and everything matters. So I don't even know what they cut. So if you know, feel free to tell me. But
they cut the scene initially where Holden arrives at his hotel and he's standing around with his peers, and they're discussing. The Carswell phones up and says, "Listen, call it off." And he says, "No, I can't do that." And he says, "Well, that could have unfortunate consequences for both of us." And he puts the phone down and he says, "Well," and then Holden turns around and says, "Well, talk of the devil." That was Carswell.
Right.
And then it goes into this sort of the conversation he has with the Indian professor and the Scottish professor and his the guy with glasses whose name I can't remember. And then that was cut out from there. And the other bit that was cut out was the Hobart farm where Holden goes out to.
Really?
Yeah, I believe
both
that was
important. Jeez.
Yes, and it's fascinating to see. It adds another dimension to how kind of terribly lost Julian Carswell has become, because his followers are these sort of degenerate, uneducated, kind of real kind of country people with a kind of horrid old matriarch who also curses him as he leaves. She says, "Let no arm be raised to defend him," as a further curse to ensure that the demon will find him and that he won't escape. And they're all kind of quite horribly degenerate, and they've got Rand Hobart in the hospital, and then I'm probably telling you too much. There's too many spoilers in this.
No, spoilers are perfectly fine with this. I mean, that's what this show is about.
Okay. So when
you can't talk social commentary without spoilers. So yeah.
Yes. Okay. So they go to the hypnotism, which is sort of done as a sort of a spectacle. They've invited along an audience, and Rand Hobart is there, who's the farmer who has gone into a shock because he's seen the demon, and they're going to bring him around with sodium pentothal and an amphetamine, I think it is. And he wakes up, and the actor, the actor is a sort of was a beloved light entertainer by the name of Brian Wilde, who starred in a British comedy called Porridge about sort of cheeky felons in a British prison, and then he starred as a sort of elderly part of an elderly trio of friends in Yorkshire called Last of the Summer Wine, and it was very much a kind of light entertainment fixture and a sort of so it's quite funny to see him in this role in a horror film, because you think, oh, hang on a minute, it's Mr. Barraclough from the the prison warden or whatever it is, but he issues this speech. He gives this speech, which is the sort of statement of faith, doesn't he? Which is up is down and back is white and good is bad and bad is good, and which would have been really shocking at the time for people. It would have been kind of quite disturbing, I think, because so it was still, Britain was still a very religious country, and people used to go to the church on a Sunday, and a lot of people in the establishment were really quite anti-blasphemy. I mean, you just have to look at how the Monty Python film Life of Brian went down like a lead balloon with some people, and they thought it was really bad that that these people were allowed to make this film. So it was still this very, very kind of sort of Christian and sort of quite fearful society in a way. Mm-hmm. And then he throws himself out of the window, and in a great scene, and it's just everything about the storytelling is just dynamic. It's just like, here you go, here's the creepy psychological scene, and then of course he kills himself because he's so terrified, and that's when Holden actually starts to think about it, and he realizes, he gets the information out of him that he has to pass the parchment back, and he thinks, oh right, and then he's starting to believe at that point, and which is good because we want him to, despite the fact that he's been kind of a slightly, I don't know, a bit of an anti-hero, not really a hero at all. You are kind of invested in him, hopefully being saved, or I am, at any rate. So the other interesting thing about the shot in the Harrington house is when the parchment flies out of his hands, and it's by the fire grate, and it's trying to get into the fire. Like it has a life of its own, and they're both standing there just sort of saying, look, it's got a life of its own. It's just trying to get away. It's trying to go,
as one does.
Yeah, I suppose so, because neither of them just go to pick it up and stop it, and Joanna's saying, no, there's something wrong here. This is not how an inanimate object should behave. And he's just like,
I wish that was her line. That would be amazing.
Well, if you do an update, you could include that.
No, paper is not supposed to do that. What are you talking about?
Yeah, the paper does a whole dance routine right after that.
Yeah.
Folds itself into a paper airplane. It's flying around the room. Yeah.
Like the Demon, the musical. I can see it. It could be a big hit. It could be a big hit on Broadway. So, yes, the other thing, I'm sort of... there's a really nice story about the panther shoot in the bit where he goes down into Carswell's study and the cat turns into a panther. Well, they did have a leopard, perhaps. I think it was. They had to shoot a real leopard, and they got a real leopard, and they realised they had nowhere to keep it, so they sent it back with Dana Andrews' stunt double to his house in Finsbury Park, and he brought in a leopard, and his wife was cooking and saying, well, what's that? And she said, well, I've got to look after this while we're making this movie. So this leopard lived with Dana Andrews' stunt double for the time that they needed it.
I would love film of him trying to explain that to his wife, like, hey, honey, yeah, this panther, this leopard is going to be living with us for a while until the movie's done.
Yes.
Can you imagine? You just walk into a pub, some guy's drinking, he's very upset, and you're like, what happened? Well, my wife left me. Oh, yeah? What happened?
I bought her a kitten. I bought her a cat back home as a pet, and she didn't like it.
Ladies love cats. What happened? It's like, well...
Yeah.
I brought her a fur coat. Unfortunately, it was still attached to the animal.
Yeah, it still had the cat in it. So, and then finally we get to the train sequence. So I have to say, I have to state for the record that I really like the scenes with the demon in it. I like the demon special effects. I'll talk a bit about this in a moment, but I don't think it does anything to... I know that Charles Bennett and Jack Turner and Dana Andrews, if they were still alive, and Peggy Cummins would probably disagree with me, but it works for me. So in the train sequence at the end, which is in the story, it is the climax, but it's dealt with very succinctly and sort of quite quickly. And in this, there's obviously Carswell is sweating it out, and there's a very the thing I noticed about the line that Holden issues. He says, "Look, I've got this statement here that says you are right and you are powerful, and you can send it to whoever you want. You can send it to the papers. It's what you want, isn't it?" And Carswell, you can see that he's finally admitted to himself that, yeah, he does want the recognition. And he's about to grab it, but then he realizes it might have the parchment in it, and he's sort of sweating horribly and looking sort of terribly frightened. And it's almost like Holden has sort of found him out, and that he's just sort of found out his weakness, which is that he can't help but want Holden to turn around and say, "Oh, right, yes, the supernatural is real. I'm so sorry, I was wrong. I mean, here I was with my rationalist, atheist sort of view of things, but I can quite clearly see that you're correct." So it's his undoing, really. It's Carswell's undoing, that he kind of needs Holden to see the truth. And there's that. I always find it quite shocking the way the monster kind of picks him up off the tracks and seems to sort of scratch at him or claw at him, and then sort of pull him apart like he was a paper bag and sort of drop him. And the movements of the model are quite, I find quite like suggestive and disturbing, kind of very good from a kind of a horror perspective. And so I suppose by this point, Turner had gone back to wherever he went to, and it was in the editing stage. So he didn't get to edit the scene with the cat, which he describes he would have done much more ambiguously, and so that the audience wasn't sure whether it had what they'd seen. And Bennett was completely consumed with hatred for Hal Chester, and famously said years later that if he walked up his driveway, he'd shoot him dead for ruining his film.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a passionate artist right there.
That is a passionate artist. So the demon itself. So there was a team on this, and there's some really good sort of photographs in the Tony Earnshaw book. If anybody who's listening is a diehard Knife the Demon fan, I do recommend getting a copy, because they're not going to be able to do a second edition, because I think there's a copyright issue with some of the drawings or some of the artwork in it. So it's sort of, get it and read it if you're an absolute sort of cult follower of this film, really. But so initially, The Demon was a sketch by Ken Adams, which, as I've mentioned, was a fairly sort of typical medieval conception of a winged demon from hell. And then they brought in a guy called Ted Samuels to build the head. And he, you do notice that when the demon's emerging from its cloud, its head looks slightly different from the close-up model. It's a slightly more, when it comes out of the cloud, it's slightly more disturbing, because it seems to move like a marionette or a sort of jerky puppet, which somehow certainly as a youngster, I found more frightening than if it was sort of in modern movies. Everything's so active. You have a werewolf, it jumps around, it snarls, and all its CGI hair kind of wafts in the wind. And this thing's sort of emerging from a cloud and sort of creakily, and like an evil toy coming to sort of take you away was sort of was really good. And the way he appears in a cloud, the demon appears in a cloud, or it appears in a cloud. And what they did is they dropped white emulsion into a tank of water, and they had it against a black background, and they had the matte painting placed in the camera. Apparently, I don't really understand how I can't visualize this, but they filmed the paint sort of expanding at high speed, so it looks like a cloud suddenly emerging.
Okay.
And they covered the walking demon in titanium chloride, which apparently makes it smoke. It doesn't sound very safe, if you ask me. But the special effects team were kind of brought in at the last minute, and they described it as a hospital job, where they had to do a very good job very quickly so it could get back to the editing room. And it's entirely possible that Jacques Tourneur didn't shoot any of those scenes, and it was Cy Enfield, who was Hal Chester's mate, and he was also a friend of Orson Welles, was Cy Enfield at one point. And anyway, so there's a rumor that that Tourneur didn't shoot those scenes, and yes, and then it kind of wraps up with him about to walk towards the train, and apparently it was an ad-libbed line where he walks up and she goes, "Are you sure?" or something, and he says, "Yes, maybe it's better not to know." I don't think that was the line he was supposed to deliver, but by that
That's
point,
a good line.
It is a good line, and apparently he and the director Dana Andrews and the director and possibly even Niall McGuinness all got really quite drunk on the last day of the shoot, because the people who played the police, the actors who played the policemen, I think, complained that it was a really bad shoot because they were out in the night in the really cold, and Dana Andrews was drunk and Jacques Tourneur seemed to be quite drunk because I guess he was wrapping the shoot kind of thing. And then it was a reasonably successful movie, and I love the way that it's sort of I when I'm on social media and on Twitter, I occasionally see people going, "Oh, this is a great movie! Love this movie." I read an article by I can't remember where it was actually. It was on some kind of horror appreciation site by somebody saying this was kind of like classic they'd like to sit down and watch, and I think it really. Yes, it's fun because of the hokey special effects. They're kind of fun and enjoyable in a sort of semi-ironic kind of way. But the script itself and the performances are really compelling. I think it presents a really good sort of a sense of increasing dread and danger, and because I think it only happens over a few nights, doesn't it? The entire film only happens over a couple of days.
I think it's like 3, something like that. Well, maybe 4 if you count the opening scene. But yeah, I don't think it's even a full week.
Yes. So it has this real sort of sense of dynamism, and I would just sort of I doubt I'll ever get bored of it, really. And also it does present a really interesting picture of what life was like in the 50s, and how there was this still very formal society. It was still kind of predicated on appearances a lot. There was a certain behavior that was just not acceptable, which we now see as kind of incredibly regressive, and it just sort of fascinates me on those levels. So I think I've covered all my talking points there.
Awesome. So, Don, what do you have that he has not hit?
Well, not necessarily talking points per se, but just some of the things about that is the questions that a film like this asks or presents. Mm-hmm. So the fact that we've got this discussion about the disbelief in the demonic, where we have mm-hmm. Holden's character who is clearly he's trying to disprove whatever has happened scientifically, right. Or at least question, the rationale for people believing in this stuff. Mm. To where even when he has that moment with Carswell, where you pointed out that he basically disrespects him or questions it, or points out that he doesn't believe what he's doing, that leads to him being cursed because, yes, Carswell is now seeing this as a threat to the power and the influence that he has. And having this guy here is now going to possibly undercut or subvert the control or the power that he's had with people in this local community. I think the other thing that gets pointed in this film is that idea of, for good and for bad, the idea that people who are in more rural communities are going to be more susceptible to this, where you can even see this as a criticism of religion or the place of religion within a society.
That's interesting.
Where you've got a person who's coming in and saying, like, really, you guys believe in X or you guys believe in this? That's been disproven. That doesn't make any sense. Whereas, one of my favorite quotes, and this is, it's one of my favorite quotes from Napoleon. It's attributed to Napoleon, but there's also quotes from the comedian George Carlin that basically talk about the place of religion in society, where Napoleon says religion was invented to keep the poor from eating the rich. And George Carlin has numerous things that he's said about organized religion in its place. And it all involves this whole idea of, you've got a system that is predicated on controlling people who are vulnerable, and you take advantage of those vulnerabilities in order to exert more control over them. Now, again, paraphrasing a lot of the comedic bits and things that he's done. But you see how Carswell uses that control, and now it's okay, I have all these people who believe in what I'm doing. And if they don't believe in it, then I lose my power. But then you start to realize through the film that it's not necessarily the power that he has to necessarily control them, but the power that he has, that he's been gifted or given through, the dark arts and the dark magic that he's been practicing. So it's now not just about preservation for himself as someone within the power structure, but also the preservation for his own life and his safety.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I got into this thing way too deep and I can't get out now. So the best way I can do this is to ensure that I keep this train rolling, which is indicative with his fear on the train when, at every step he starts to think like, oh shit, did they hand me, did he hand me the runes? Did he hand me the parchment? He said, oh, you forgot your book. That's not my book. I found that book was here.
Keep it. Yes. Would you like a cigarette? Yes. Oh, no, thanks. I'm giving up. I think he says, doesn't he? He's totally paranoid. But it's interesting, yes, because he's controlled the rural family by, I guess, because he can actually demonstrate that, these entities are real,
Right.
But again, he's terrified. It's like the atom bomb in his arsenal. He finally, if the worst comes to the worst, he'll summon the demon. But he really doesn't want to. He doesn't want to have to do that because he knows he's opening up something that's far more powerful than he is, and he can't really control it. But yes, it's fascinating that this sort of foreshadowing of kind of rural horror and folk horror where. The farmhouse is really dilapidated and run down and very, very creepy. Like these people are just sort of, they're slowly becoming inhuman, or maybe they always were. But yeah, it is interesting because his is the only religious focal point. The only religion that's discussed is Carswell's religion, which is the religion of evil. And Holden and Harrington and possibly Professor Kumar is the only one who actually expresses some kind of belief, and he says that he believes in devils. And,
right.
He's also got that nice line where they're looking at their whiskies, which Kumar's not joining them with, and I think Holden says, they say alcohol is the devil's drink. And he says, this is actually very, very pleasant. And then Kumar says the devil's at his most dangerous when he's being pleasant. And it nicely sets up Carswell turning up and being super polite and just so polite all the time. So, but the religion is used to control people, but it's something that he's not, he's Carswell himself has lost control of it. And there's no, it's not like they defeat the demon by kind of getting crucifixes or being blessed or baptized or getting holy water or anything like that. It's not Christianity versus evil. It's not God versus Satan. It's the rational, the analytical, the rational, against the irrational, subconscious, the mystery of the universe, I suppose, and it's nicely framed as such, and they don't drag in any other religious imagery except for right at the beginning when they're showing you lots of pictures of devils. So yes, it is quite interesting from that respect because it's flipped. So you only get the religious viewpoint from the villain. And there are no religious views or thoughts on the behalf of the protagonist and Joanna Harrington, who's basically the hero, I think, of it, although not the main character. Anyway,
the other thing I thought about, this is just me watching way too many movies like this, is I was expecting that train scene that, and maybe this could be, in James's version if he writes it, I should say when he writes it.
You know how many projects I already have lined up? I don't have time
I know.
Wait until they find out what we're doing in May. Then they'll know why I have no time. Continue.
Don't speak of those things. You mustn't speak of them. It's that I sincerely thought that that Joanna was a distraction, or she was. I'm sorry, not Joanna. Carswell was the distraction for Joanna. To where I'm looking at her and I'm like, shit, she's getting involved. Like, when she tricks him, tricks. Oh my gosh, I almost said Humboldt. when she when she pulls the I guess the trick on Holden to do the seance and all this other stuff, right? So I'm thinking like, oh shit, maybe she's the one. Maybe she's actually trying to get this stuff going, to get this guy who's scientific to at least approve of it or claim that it's real or something. So when they're on the train and Carswell, which I thought was hilarious when Carswell was pulling this whole, yes, I've hypnotized her because I don't want to have to deal with any of the small chit chat or the annoying conversation. And I'm thinking to myself, like, holy shit, that would be a great trick to pull, like if you're on a plane or a train or anywhere else. And it's kind of like, hi, how are you doing? You will not talk to me. And then they just completely shut down. But so I was thinking like, well, maybe she's putting on an act and she's got Carswell doing this. And I think this is kind of related to when we were watching and talking about Dead Silence a while ago, that maybe she was the one. So when that didn't happen, I was partially disappointed because I was thinking like that would have been a cool twist. But then again, I'm looking at it in 2021 eyes, not 1950s eyes, to where that trick or that push might not have been not necessarily well received, but not that anyone would have necessarily been thinking about like, I'm gonna throw a couple of other twists and turns into this to make people think we're going a certain way. That, and I don't know how it would have been received in 57. But when Carswell jumps off of the train or runs off of the train chasing after the parchment, I was immediately expecting he's going to chase the parchment and run it or get hit by a train. So there's that quick moment where the train on the other track just whooshes by. And I thought I had missed it. I was like, okay, well, maybe they edited this in a certain way to where you didn't see him get hit by the train, but you just assume that he gets hit by the train. And then like a couple of seconds later, you see him still chasing after the paper. You're like, damn it, that was a great opportunity. I wonder how many people actually that scene got to where they immediately thought like, oh man, he's been hit by the train. And now we're going to be debating whether or not this was something where he was so freaked out at the possibility of dying because of the parchment that he ended up carelessly running into a train, or
really
in fact, the train was part of this plan.
That's really interesting you say that, because I'm pretty sure in the Tony Earnshaw book, that's kind of how Charles Bennett wanted to finish the film. Okay. And he wanted it to be exactly as you've described, where you can't tell whether Carswell's been hit by the train or mauled by a demon because there's no way of knowing, or whether he was just so overcome with paranoia and sort of having an episode of psychosis induced by fear that he was an actual fact. And Charles Bennett wanted to leave it much more to the imagination of the viewer. But again, it's great when the demon picks him up and pulls him apart like a rag doll. I just think it's quite shocking for a 50s movie. Oh yeah. But it's funny you should say that, because I'm fairly certain that's in the Earnshaw book that Bennett wanted it to be as you described it.
I personally like that it's not left to our imagination. Like, I think that's a great ending and I would enjoy it, but I like this better. Like when I was reading that they didn't even want the demon in it and wanted to leave it like, is it happening? Is it not? I was like, I love these demon scenes.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, if you want to show me like, I don't know how you would do it with the story structure, but if you showed me the questionable version and then I got to see the other one, like how Saw brings everything back at the end, something like that, right? Like, I'd be okay with that, but I love it the way it is, and I feel like it would have lost the thing that I love most about it if they had done the questionable endings.
I think it works much better for the film that you're let in on the secret right at the beginning, that there is a demon. It's big, it's terrifying, it's inexplicable. Like I say, it just opens up with this that great shot where he's driving out, Harrington, the uncle is driving out to Lufford Hall, and all the trees are going past in the light. You can see the light of the headlights lighting up all the trees, making them look very spectral. And then he gets there and the butler won't let him in, but he sort of barges in, and there's Julian playing cards with his mum, and then he realizes that the demon's coming, so he sends him off quickly on his way, and the drive back and all that. You get the really good visuals, so it sets this up as this is going to be a spooky film. You're introduced to the villain, you get back, and then bang, you get the monster, and then right, okay, so in this world, in this story, this is actual fact real. This is possible. There are giant demons that emerge from clouds of smoke and rip people apart. And I think that the movie as a whole works better for us knowing that, really, in hindsight. And I mean, I know that it's not the writer's vision, but with any kind of work of art, when you present it to the world, it's going to be subject to how the people who read it, and the audience that consume it and read it, how they interpret it and what they bring to it. And so, the author is in a way just a shepherd for a story, I think. And once the story has been presented to the audience, it sort of belongs to them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm.
Now, I think it immediately raises the stakes, raises the tension.
Mm-hmm.
Like it really helps if the whole time we didn't know, and we had this guy telling us, I don't believe any of this. I think, at least today, myself, I would be cynical and be like, yeah, we'll see, but like this immediately draws me in and makes me be like, no, you're stupid, pay attention.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, plus it really, I think you'd lose the importance of Harrington and how she's the one who's still like, none of this makes sense. So the only answer is that it's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
so I think you'd lose all of that if you got rid of this. And so I'm glad that it's the way it is.
Yes, I would agree with that. And yeah, Harrington is genuine. She's genuinely inquisitive, and she's genuinely open-minded. And I mean, Holden, you can understand why he's so antithetical towards this idea of there being a supernatural curse that's pursuing him, and it sets us up really nicely. So you don't think that he's ever being stupid. He's just behaving and acting in accordance with his worldview, with based on his experience and what he's understood in the past, and how many kind of hoaxes he's debunked, obviously. And he's a psychologist, and he can explain it all the way. But it's kind of fun to see him come up against this the one time when, in actual fact, he meets something real. It's really good fun, and it makes you care about him more, because you can see him sort of slowly actually beginning to accept that he doesn't understand what's happening to him, and then by the end he's like, well, it must be. You can see him thinking this I'm not going to take any chances if this is true or not. So he's sort of, his actions and him trying to return the parchment, that on one level he's accepted that he is in dire peril, and he's sort of he's finally, Joanna Harrington's opened his mind, and he's sort of but then of course at the end he doesn't want confirmation of that. He doesn't want to see with his own eyes the confirmation of it. He'd rather retreat back into the world of reason, away from the shadows that sort of haunt the outside of his sort of particular mentality and his idea of the universe. And he decides to sort of, that he would rather not have that confirmation that yes, there was something horrible after him.
Well, yeah, and that completely destroys his worldview as well. Yeah. If he does see it's one of those questions that I guess plagues mankind, as far as like, if there's something out there, do you want to know? Like, are you going to find more comfort in knowing, or are you going to find more comfort in not knowing? Because a lot of times when our worldview is broken, that makes us question all types of things, as far as the reality around us, our own identities, our histories, our backgrounds, everything that's been told to us or instructed to us, because he's living in that world. And I wrote this down as one of the questions. And because he talks about believing in ghosts, and he makes that cute little quip where he says, "Most of my friends or some of my best friends are ghosts."
Yes.
But if he's willing to believe in that, what is the comfort in believing in one aspect of the supernatural and but dismissing others, or dismissing the ones that other people happen to have, which definitely strikes me not necessarily as odd, because we all seem to do it, but just the fact that this is a guy who believes in, I guess, in reason and pursuing at least information, but he doesn't want to have anything confirmed for him.
Yes, but then
good or bad.
Finally, when he has got the chance to confront the evidence and make up his own mind, as a scientist should, by his own definition from earlier on in the film. Every scientist should be saying, "Show me." And when he has the opportunity, when he has been shown something, it's just it's too frightening for him, and he backs away, and she quite wisely sort of goes with him. They realize that there's a kind of wisdom in not delving into things that you can't understand, and that and they've had a lucky escape. And it ends really suddenly, doesn't it, with just the another train coming through the station, and then the credits roll, and you think, yes, that's great. This is just, that's exactly the right point to end it. We don't need to see anything else after that, and it's very, very cool. And also, I mean, it's kind of fun to see Stonehenge when you could actually walk around amongst the stones, because now, of course, you can't. They're all walled off, but he walks right up to them, and they obviously have a bit of a set with the runes, and he compares them, doesn't he? And this is when he's sort of starting to think maybe there's more to this than he's kind of credited it for. There's some lovely interactions, just very subtle things, that when when they meet at the airport, and the newspaperman says, "Go easy on our ghosts, won't you? We're rather fond of them." And they're having this little sort of slightly kind of jokey banter, which is when I think he says, "Oh, some of my best friends are ghosts," doesn't he? He says, "Don't worry, I'll be very gentle with them." And it's all a bit of a laugh for them, and and then all of a sudden he's sort of plunged into this sort of murky, very murky world. And I do also really like the way that Carswell pops up. One of the things about one of the shots in it that always stayed with me was when the British Museum and the polite librarian appears and says, "Oh, the true discoveries of witches and demons. The only copy is missing." And then he says, "Most remiss," and off he goes. And you hear Carswell's voice behind him going, "I've got a copy you could look at. It's in my house." And he turns around, and Carswell's popped there. And then he gives him the card. And as he's watching him go away, he's in this sort of shimmering, kind of murky corridor. He's sort of rushing off into the distance down this long, long corridor. And you get a real sense that he's sort of opened up some sort of portal straight into the British Museum. So he can steal the book in the first instance and add it to his collection, because he's sort of still a bit of a child, but also so he can sort of move there and sort of intimidate past the runes, basically, to Holden. And I really like the way that the camera would suddenly kind of shimmer as if it was slightly underwater. And it also does it in the farmhouse sequence where he goes to see the Hobart family, and he's walking out, and they all sort of start to ripple, and the whole sort of room seems to get a bit sort of trippy, and he sort of staggers out, and there's a sigil on the door, which wasn't there before, I think.
Yeah, I didn't think so either, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't go back and look, but yeah, that kind of hit me too.
And but the scene of Carswell kind of rushing off down that sort of dark, shimmering corridor is it's very nice how they've kind of work in his other magical powers. I mean, he can summon the storm. He can quite clearly sort of dominate and hypnotize people at will. He can move between. He can magically sort of teleport himself from place to place, and then, of course, the demon is it's the last resort for him when all else fails, because he does try to persuade Holden to drop it. to start with, and this is why it's so structured so nicely, so you get a sense of Carswell's fear about, having to take this step that he doesn't want to do, and he just wants these people to go away and leave him alone and get on with whatever kind of horrible, depraved things he's getting up to with his cult. And there are so many great shots in this, and I mean, Tourneur was really obsessed with smoke, which is, I think, why the demon appears in a kind of. I know, because he didn't, maybe not directed those, but with Tourneur with smoke, in Out of the Past, which is his sort of film noir movie, he had the cinematographer place big blinding lights into the empty space between Robert Mitchum and the other characters, so that when they exhaled their smoke, it would really light up in these bright white clouds, and he could the actors could use the smoke to describe how they kind of related to each other. If they were kind of antagonists, they'd sort of blow smoke aggressively at each other or away from each other if they're so he was. It's just such a beautiful film to watch. It's so luxuriantly sort of monochrome, and I love that look with the really blinding lights, and then the really kind of inky, dark, mysterious nighttime, really rich cinematography that he brings to it, and indeed all the films he made in black and white were sort of, he was a master of that kind of photography. So it just ticks all sorts of boxes for me, I think.
Well, I understand why this is your favorite and why you've seen it so many times.
Yes, it is my favorite film of all time. I mean, there are films that I'd love to watch again, and I will watch again. In the Mouth of Madness was the first one I approached you about. I think it was just like,
yes, it was.
And what a great movie, and I'll definitely watch that again. And The Thing, okay, they're brilliant movies. Treasure of the Sierra Madre by John Huston, I'd quite happily watch that again. And similarly, that doesn't get old, that doesn't get boring. There's not a wasted scene in that. And I really admire Nice the Demon for this sort of, just like a train in itself going to its destination. It was just, every single scene it seems right. It seems to belong. It advances the suspense of it all. It's such a well scripted sort of story, and brisk, and it doesn't hang around. It kind of moves along very, very quickly, and it establishes those characters as very compelling, believable characters really, really quickly, with a few just sort of good lines of dialogue and situations, and seeing what they're kind of doing in their situation. And but the airport where Joanna Harrington is sort of trying to call her uncle, but the telephone line is down and she can't get through. And he's sort of coming down. I think that's Heathrow Terminal. That's a Heathrow Terminal, because it's really nice the way it starts off in this very modern, brightly lit environment as well. So it's all kind of like, oh, la 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 la, here is the real world, and everything's perfectly normal, and there's airports and taxis, right, and beautiful women in wonderful sports cars, and here is my lift to the hotel, and these are my colleagues, and here's a drink. And then as the movie goes on, you end up those final scenes where it's all at night, and you're surrounded by the darkness by the end of it, and it's just and the bit where he's chased through the woods was very good too. The footprints in the ground always reminded me of Forbidden Planet. If you remember
see that. Yeah.
But the being from the id, the footsteps sort of stomp in the sand. It's pretty similar, I thought.
Well, you mentioned the wood scene, or at least when Holden is going into the woods, and it again, the great thing about horror films is there's so much depth. It's a genre that really people should not be criticizing the way in which they do to downplay its relevance or downplay its intellectual capabilities. But with that being said, I love how cliches in horror films, like, they're not locked into a specific time period or a specific subgenre within horror, because there's that moment when he's told not to go outside, not go through the woods. What the hell does he do? He goes out and just runs through the woods. So I'm thinking, like, all right, he's going to see something. Something's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
Because you broke a rule or you did not take the advice that somebody gave you. So I'm just sitting there, just, all right, come on. I got to see what's going to happen to this guy. Because I want him to, which eventually, as we talked about, I want him to get to that point where he sees something and that changes him. But then the reality is the opportunity that he has to eventually see it, he turns it down because it's like, it's best not to know, which has been covered in other movies before, and not just within horror itself, but has been covered before of you have this struggle of, I need to know the answer. I need to understand what's taking place. But then you realize what that's going to do to you. And not necessarily negatively to where you change your worldview, as we talked about, but would he become consumed with it, like Carlson is, how he becomes consumed with it to where this is who I am. This is Carswell. I say Carswell becomes consumed with it to where now this becomes his identity and who he has to be and how he controls other people. Like, could you imagine the combination of scientific inquiry that Holden has, and then combining that with the supernatural? He's a psychiatrist. He's a man of science. So you kind of question, like, would he be tempted to put those two together, for his own benefit?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of within the confines of the story, I suppose they have to remain in their kind of quite well-defined roles. But I mean, this is the beauty of a story like this, when you think it is, in actual fact, a really good template for a story. And like I was saying, I think Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell was partially based on it, or was a very similar story. And there have been a couple of other versions of this story, but there's no, once something has obviously sort of, an idea has sort of got out into this sort of general, into the general arena for writers, I think, it is interesting to pick up these ideas if you're at all creative and thinking, actually, what would it be like if the scientist has this, if you start with a character who was a total rationalist and didn't believe in any of that and is just getting sucked into this sort of, the supernatural or the kind of numinous world of magic or whatever, and it does. Yes, the great thing about it does leave you with something to think about afterwards. Because it leaves them right there, and it leaves you with that choice, with him backing away from it and deciding, I'm not going to find out.
Right.
I'd rather not know. And it's sort of you're thinking, I mean, this. What would they do afterwards? And you can imagine that character would sort of, obviously this would be a defining experience for them if you choose to imagine them existing outside of the movie, which is always quite interesting. And it's very good. Although, I mean, there are some bits where it is a kind of cliched because he's the male lead, and so he's the one who goes in and breaks into Lufford Hall. Joanna Harrington wants to come with him, and he sort of says, no, you stay here, I'd rather go myself. And does she let him go herself because it's the 1950s and he's a man and he said this and she's listening to him, or is she letting him go so that he might see something or have some experience that will persuade him? Which is I think there's last few times I've seen a lot more in Joanna Harrington's character than just sort of the love interest, because as you point out, she's not the love interest. She's the sort of she's the guiding spirit. She's the guiding light. She's the one who's trying to help him, to save him. She's the sort of the hero really of the picture. Whereas, but it's sort of interesting how he's sort of very assumptive about sort of everything, because he's this sort of very well-to-do, highly thought of academic man, and he's sort of like, oh no, I know what this is all about. This is the classic psychological trick that witch doctors use. If they're going to put a curse on you, they tell you about it well in advance, is one of his lines, I think. It's just so that you'll get so worried about it that you probably might have an accident and die, kind of thing. And she's like, no, you don't understand. There's something terribly wrong. And he's completely dismissive of it.
Right.
And it's sort of, you do get a sense of the sort of, I guess the sort of politics of the time a bit. But one of the things that really, again, I really like about this film is that the characters sort of transcend that in a way. And you can see that it is of a time, it is of a certain time, but also that they're all really strong. They're all really strong. The three main characters are really equally compelling, I think. I love her car too. She's just, it's like she's like the most glamorous sort of primary school teacher with a sort of. I mean, none of my primary school teachers drove sports cars, put it that way.
Yeah, mine neither. All right, so let's jump towards the end here because we're closing in on time. I just want to. I know you guys have mentioned a lot of films already, but is there any particular film that you think people should watch if they enjoyed this?
Oh God, my mind has gone a blank. I kind of see this as sort of a sui generis sort of movie, and it's kind of totally. I don't think there's anything like it. So, Don, could you help me?
All right. Here we go.
Just for the record, I was going to throw out Drag Me to Hell, but we've said it like 900 times already. And outside of that, I got nothing either. So Don, it's all you.
All right. This is how my mind works as far as recommending films that we're close to this one. And it's the whole idea of disbelief, supernatural, science versus the magic, however you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've got a few. So I would start off with Silent Hill as far as being someplace that's unfamiliar to you, and especially when you mention things like the lighting or the way this film is shot. I would say the same thing with the way that Silent Hill is shot. Skeleton Key, which we covered on a previous episode. Hereditary, The Exorcist, Prince of Darkness. You mentioned Into the Mouth of Madness.
Mm-hmm.
Eve's Bayou, which does tackle that whole thing of, I'm not sure if magic is real, but I'm going to try it out, and it leads to some negative consequences. The Haunting, Wicker Man, and because of the way the demon is shot, I included these last two, which are Creature from the Black Lagoon. Actually, I take that back. Creature from the Black Lagoon I included because the way that women are portrayed, as well as the creature design, and then Godzilla.
Right.
Nice.
I can definitely see the Creature from the Black Lagoon is also a very distinctive. That's a very distinctive design, isn't it? I can't remember the name of the woman who made it, who made the mask. But sorry, anyway, I am digressing, and I realise that we're running out of time. So
it's all good. No, I think that would have never occurred to me as something to watch with this, and I think that would actually be a really fascinating double feature. Yeah. But Silent Hill, if I was going to do the double feature thing I do sometimes, Silent Hill is a great choice with this. That would be such an interesting mix because they're so different while having so much in common.
Right. I do have an idea. There's a 1940s movie called Dead of Night, and it's an anthology. It's a horror anthology, and most of them are pretty weak. But there's one in it with Michael Redgrave as a ventriloquist who has a haunted puppet.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah.
We do love haunted puppets on this show.
Yeah. So that would be Dead of Night. I think it's 1941. I'm not sure.
Very cool. All right. Well, let's bring it back to you, Charles. You want to tell everyone where they can find you on social media and get a hold of your stuff?
Yes. So on social media, on Twitter, I'm known as Dice_Comics, which is a small comics collective I started up with an incredibly talented artist and writer called Norm Chung, who is at the moment crafting a sort of gothic samurai tale. And so anyway, we decided that we wanted more sort of control over what we were doing, and we created Dice Comics. That's at Dice_Comics on Twitter. And please do have a look at my website, which is charlescutting.com, https://charlescutting.com. And that's got links out to my book Kadath and How to Buy the Fiery Crown, which is a sort of fairy story, as I mentioned, on Comixology. And also there's a couple of free graphic novels. So there's a free graphic novel from Open University written by Professor Simon Bell, illustrated by myself, about how fear is used to manipulate populations, mainly. There's more to it than that, but that's sort of it in a nutshell. So yes, please follow on Twitter, and but more importantly, please have a look at the site, charlescutting.com. And thank you very much for inviting me on this podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
No, thank you for being on.
This was great. I learned so much. So yeah.
I'm sitting here taking notes.
And if you are a diehard Night of the Demon fan, having seen the Tony Earnshaw book, it would definitely be worth getting if you're an absolute aficionado of this film, just for the set designs by Ken Adam and some of the promotional posters and memorabilia and stuff as well. I haven't spilled all the beans on the stories about the cast and crew, so... And there it is. Now I think I'm going to need a cup of tea because my throat is feeling a bit dry from all this talking.
Oh, please do not let us keep you.
All right.
It's been great having you on. It's like James said, this was I would say this is a very informative dissertation level discussion about.
Oh, thank you.
Your film, the film that you love, film that's your favorite. Because even going back through it, like I said, I was sitting here taking notes on much of the conversation that you were at, or much of the discussion you were adding to the conversation. Because again, like you said, when you watch a film, again, you see new things, and especially when we have these discussions with people about their films, the films that they choose, we discover things that we didn't think about when we were watching it, and definitely prompts us to. I'm going to volunteer James in this discussion as well. Prompts us to go back and rewatch those films to look for those things and get a different impression in a lot of cases based off of other people's contributions.
Absolutely. No, that's one of the reasons doing this show, that I want guests to pick the movie, because if it's something you love, you probably have way more to say, or have analyzed it more, or it's influenced your life in some way, or whatever else. And that's automatically always way more interesting to me than if I just said, hey, why don't you come on and do this film?
Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah. So no, I love that you did your favorite movie. That's great.
Like I say, it's been a real pleasure. And thank you very much for having me as a guest.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. So I guess that wraps it up for this week. As always, I am James Sabata.
And I'm checking my pockets for little pieces of parchment.
And we'll see you next week here at thenecronoma.com, as long as he doesn't find anything.